Hello and welcome to Must Read Fiction, a place for people who know that life is better with a novel in hand. I'm Erin Popelka, and I am so delighted to be here today with author Crystal King. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's such a pleasure. So a little bit about Crystal King. She is a novelist, editor, professor, social media professional, and critical and creative thinker. She has taught writing, creativity, and social media in colleges around Boston, including Boston University and the Harvard Extension School. Her debut novel was Feast of Sorrow, which was nominated for the Center for Fiction First Novel Prize. And her new novel is The Chef's Secret. I've got a copy of it right here, and you too. Oh my word, this is beautiful.
I have lots of copies of it.
It's so good. One in your hands, one on the shelf behind you, one in my hands, which comes out February 13th, The Chef's Secret. So
Actually, the 12th.
The 12th, thank you for that correction. So The Chef's Secret out February 12th. So let's just start there. Tell me about The Chef's Secret.
So The Chef's Secret is basically a story about a chef, which is why there's all this food and wine on the cover. And it's a story that is about Bartolomeo Scappi. And actually, on my shelf is the cookbook.
Oh my word.
I'll talk a little bit about the cookbook, but let me finish telling you about the book. So Bartolomeo Scappi was a chef that lived in the 1500s in the Renaissance, and he wrote this cookbook. This is what his legacy is. And there's only one English translation by Terence Scully. This is basically it's L'Opera di Bartolomeo Scappi, the works of Bartolomeo Scappi.
And can we just pause for like all of your post-its and like the hours and the blood, sweat, and tears that have gone into that book?
There's a lot of years in this book.
Sure.
It's and so this man, Bartolomeo, we don't know a lot about him. He was born in Dumenza on the border of Switzerland and Italy. And we know he lived in a couple different parts of Italy. He lived in at least Venice, Milan, Bologna, and Rome. And he was the chef to several different cardinals and popes. And he left behind this crazy cookbook, which has over 1,000 recipes in it. And since there was so little known about his life, I thought I would make up all the rest. And the book is told from two points of view. There is Bartolomeo Scappi, and I'm not spoiling this too much, but it begins when he's on his deathbed, and his nephew, Giovanni, and Giovanni was a real person. The cookbook that he wrote is actually dedicated to his nephew, Giovanni, who was his apprentice. And but we know nothing about him other than the fact that he was the apprentice and the nephew for Bartolomeo Scappi. But Giovanni is mourning his uncle. His uncle has just basically died, and he learns that his uncle has given him the keys to a strong box full of letters and notes that are all in code. But when he starts to piece it together, he realizes that his uncle had had a 50-year love affair with a noblewoman who he wasn't supposed to be with. And so Giovanni is moving forward in the future, trying to uncover all of these secrets of his uncle's life. And at the same time, you're getting you're in Bartolomeo's life and in scene with him, understanding how he became the man he is and who this woman Stella is to him in his life. And so that's the story in a nutshell.
Oh, fantastic. And just so many good details there, both the backdrop of Renaissance Italy, these questions of love affairs, these questions of food. It just is rich and delightful. It's so much good stuff happening.
Yeah, it's to me, it was just like, it was when I learned about Bartolomeo Scappi, I realized that the cookbook is all we really have of him. But I thought his life had to have been fascinating in some way. He knew all of these crazy famous people. Like he probably fed Michelangelo, for example. He worked for the most powerful men in the world. And I thought, well, what would a life have been like for him? So it was super fun to put all those pieces together.
Oh, fantastic. So how did you first hear about Bartolomeo Scappi and his nephew Giovanni? And what compelled you to spend a little bit more time and do that research and put all those Post-it notes into the beautiful cookbook?
So I really, when I was writing Feast of Sorrow, I did a lot of research in general in food history. And A Feast of Sorrow, for those of you who aren't familiar with the book, is about the world's first gourmand, a man named Apicius, and his name is on the oldest known cookbook. And so when I was doing a lot of research about him, it was a lot of history of Italian cooking. And so that's really why I ended up understanding who Bartolomeo was, is because I would end up reading all of the history and get sucked down this rabbit hole of really fascinating information about the lives of these Italian culinary heroes. That's what I think of them as. They're the people who created the foundation for a lot of Italian cuisine and traditions that we know and love today. And so that's kind of the reason I got involved with Bartolomeo. I bought the cookbook more out of as a whim, and then I realized how cool it was and how amazing this cookbook is, and I thought I had to write about it.
Oh, fantastic, fantastic. And also really interesting that there's not a big historical record, so that a lot of those personal details you got to fill in as a novelist. So how did it feel like to both take the historical record and then add your own spin on what those lives must have been like?
Yeah, it's a really fun thing, because one of the things I want to try to do in my fiction is stay true to the history that we are aware of. For the most part, I actually take a lot of swerves in Chef's Secret, but where I do, I try to be very clear about that, at least in the author's note, to say, hey, I took a huge liberty with this person, but here's who this person really was. I want to try to stay true to the flavor of the era and the general historical details, and then give you a hint on where I might have changed a few things. And so for me, I knew a lot about Bartolomeo's recipes, and we know a lot about his employers and the different cardinals and the different popes that he worked for, and some of the challenges he might have had working for those individuals. And so I look at like historical fiction as a connect the dots sort of thing. I know this detail and I know that detail. So how did this happen before that, and what were the commonalities between them? Who were the people and the players? And so for me, it's just immense fun.
Oh, delightful, delightful. And you brought up Feast of Sorrow. And so that novel also is set in historical Italy and has lots of luscious food. So can you tell me a little bit more about what compels you to write about historical Italy and like really luscious foods and some pretty fantastic chefs?
Yeah, so I I was really surprised I ended up writing about food, and now I kind of can't imagine not doing it. To me, food is such a universal connector. It's something that we need it to live, right? But beyond that, we actually eat it to enjoy it, and it's a part of all of our rituals. It's a part of every single religion for the most part. It's a part of all of our our relationships with other individuals. There's so many meals that are built into the rituals of our daily lives. And I love how it brings people together. It's also woven into our politics. There's so much politics in food. And when I think about like how food really brings people together, I wanted to explore that a bit more. And I think it's just incredible fun to write about food and to think about what makes food interesting to people. And these chefs had just really interesting ideas, and going back in history and discovering some of those flavors and where things have changed is really fascinating to me. You know, what ancient Roman food is really, really different than modern Italian food. But by the time you get to the 1500s into Scappi, some of the food is starting to look really familiar. That's where tortellini starts to come in, and meat is being prepared in ways that seem somewhat familiar. There's a fried chicken recipe in this cookbook, so
Amazing.
yeah, so it starts to feel more familiar, and I love how history pulls all that together, and to go back in time and find your way through it.
Oh, fantastic. And so I'm so curious, with all of the research that you've done, did you kind of jump down any rabbit holes of like details that you just couldn't get enough of and you just followed them to see how far they'd go, or any stories that you're like, Wait, how did that come about? Like, any kind of juicy research stories that you can share with us?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many. And also, too, they start to get confused in my mind because I'm researching book 3.
Oh my
And
word.
it's set in the same era. It's set in the Renaissance. And so I've had similar questions, and people will, and I start to go down a path of, oh yeah, I learned about this. And then I realize, oh, that's not relevant to this book. But in this book, one of the things actually that I found really fascinating is the comet that I have appear at the very beginning of the book. On the day of Bartolomeo's funeral, this comet appears, and it basically becomes the frame for the book. And all of the activity within the present of Giovanni's life takes place under the specter of this comet that's in the sky. And I included it because I was super fascinated with the reality of the Great Comet of 1577. And the Great Comet of 1577 appeared in November and was in the sky until I think the middle or end of January. So for at least 2 months, it was in the sky. And people all over Europe saw it. And there were some of the astronomers of that time. Tycho Brahe, I think that's how you say his name, was one of them. And there's a couple other really well-known, I want to say Copernicus. I think Copernicus and Tycho were connected. I'm not all up on the astronomy, but this comet was in the sky and everyone saw it. It was in literature. It was in all sorts of paintings of the time. And I thought, what this must have been like for people not really understanding what it was. And the fact that it stayed in the sky for so long. And I loved the connection of it. And the pet name that Bartolomeo Scappi has for his lover is Stella, which means star in Italian. And so there is a connection there as well. And I personally am just so obsessed with stars. They're like my personal thing. And so I had to include it. But the comets was just like this crazy thing that it stayed in the sky for so long. And I had to think, this must have scared people, right?
Mhm.
So I had a lot of fun with
Yeah.
that.
Oh, super interesting. And what an interesting detail. I'm seeing kind of the parallel. Certainly, I'm thinking about the total eclipse that happened across the United States a couple years ago, and how most people could tell you exactly where they were and how they watched it, and if they were in the, kind of path of totality or not. And so that's something that truly all of us across the country can speak to, that one moment. And that is, of course, on a cosmic sense. And then, of course, you were talking about food and how food connects us. And that is this like very individual sense. But like, I'm sure if you ask someone, what's the most memorable meal you'd ever have, they could just, tell you, oh yes, there was that fantastic restaurant for our anniversary where it was all the
Right.
course, you can just rattle it off. And so I love this idea of both food connecting us in these like really intimate ways, but also the cosmos and these comets connecting us in these like really, kind of galactic ways. That's super
Right.
interesting. Wonderful. Well, so speaking of food, so food is a big part of the Chef's Secret and Feast of Sorrow. And I know that you also have kind of played with some of these recipes, certainly from some of the older cookbooks, and then, kind of like way back when for Feast of Sorrow around the time of Caesar. So tell me what you've learned in terms of like your own cooking and playing around with some of these historical recipes.
Yeah, so both time frames were really challenging in different kinds of ways. When I was working on Feast of Sorrow, of course, I had to test out the recipes in the cookbook that's named after Apicius. And there was garum and everything, fish sauce. And I grew up in Idaho, and I never really liked fish, and I still don't to this day. I like shellfish. I will eat all the shrimp and mussels in the world, but when it comes to like fishy fish, it's just not my thing. And so the idea of cooking with fish sauce was super daunting. And what I discovered then is that it imparted an umami flavoring. It was a salty flavoring that enhanced the food. It wasn't necessarily fishy. And so once I figured that out, then I realized this is an amazing ingredient in all sorts of cooking. And there's still Parthian chicken is a dish that we still make for dinner all the time because it's so easy. Once you have all the ingredients, it's super easy, comes together in an awesome way. But in the Scappi cookbook, there's so many possibilities. I have so many things I still want to cook here. But we cooked, my husband, I say we, my husband loves to cook. I'm more of a baker. And in ancient Rome, they didn't have a lot of things to bake. It was mostly donut, fried fritter type stuff with honey on it. But in this cookbook, we start to get into pies, and there's all sorts of pastries and really interesting dishes like that. There's so many different meat recipes. There's a whole book on fish, because he worked for a papal kitchen, and they had what they called in the Catholic faith feast days. So those days were for honoring the saints, and you wouldn't eat meat on them. And so they had elaborate menus for those days that did not include meat. And so there's a whole chapters on that. But some of the crazy dishes that we made, like I mentioned, the fried chicken, and fried chicken doesn't sound that weird, right? And a lot of people will say, nah, fried chicken's a Southern thing, but it's actually not. And there's also too, I was looking into the history of fried chicken. Some people think that it's a Scottish thing and that it came to the South by some way of Scotland. But the Scots probably got it from Italy. But I'm not geeky enough to go too deep into the history of fried chicken, but I am pretty sure this is one of the earliest recipes for it. It is identical in every aspect of how you make fried chicken, except the flavors are really strange. Because in the Renaissance, they believed, well, not believed, but the nobility had way more money than anyone else. And certain ingredients were so costly that if you had the ability to be able to purchase cloves and cinnamon and nutmeg and coriander and put sugar in your food and get rose water from the East, you're going to use it in abundance to show off your wealth. And so fried chicken with nutmeg, cloves, coriander, cinnamon, and rosewater is a really strange flavor combination for our palates. That is a weird one. And that one took a lot of tries to kind of get right, to get it to a point where we were like, okay, we can eat this. This is good.
Right. Oh, so interesting, right? Both the history and the flavor combination.
Yeah.
That is absolutely fascinating. Were there other really weird ingredients that you bumped into that you were like, wow, I can't believe people eat this?
Well, a lot of the things that we didn't cook with them because we either couldn't procure the ingredient, or for some reason that they're just things we just don't eat today. Like there's actually I should look this up a little bit more specific so I can give more specifics, but there's a recipe that's very similar to lasagna. It's a layered dish of some sort. And one of the layers in the dish is actually calf's eyeballs. And like, we're not going to eat that. But that was considered to be yummy. And
amazing.
But they would also eat, they loved getting more unusual meats like hedgehog and bear and porcupine. There's recipes for porcupine in the cookbook. They would do all of the crazy things, like it was every kind of bird you can possibly imagine. They had, there's a recipe in here for peacock and how to make it so it still looks real, like it's alive. So you would cook it and then basically put it back inside its feathers, and like it's just crazy stuff. And so there's those kinds of things. There's also really interesting tidbits of information that is kind of seeded throughout the cookbook on some things that we are familiar with, but you wouldn't have realized it was Renaissance based. Like foie gras, for example. Foie gras, he makes a mention of how the Jews in the ghetto in Rome were fattening up geese, and that their livers tasted well. And so there's this indication that the Jews were actually selling the livers of these geese for foie gras. And I'm pretty sure that foie gras is not kosher today. But it turns out I started looking a little bit more. This is a rat hole I went down. I started wondering, because my friend of mine said, no, that can't be true because foie gras isn't kosher, and she's Jewish. I figure she knows what she's talking about. But when I looked it up, it turns out at the time, Jews in the ghetto of Rome, they didn't cook with dairy. and they needed some sort of fat to be able to cook their food in. So they were raising chicken for the chicken grease, for the schmaltz, basically is what they called it. And it turns out that in the process of creating the fattest chickens they could, in order to be, or fattest geese and chickens, birds in general, you would confine them, and you would do, and what you would do with foie gras today, because they become very fatty and therefore you would get more grease, but then you also get those livers. And so they might not necessarily have eaten them, but they certainly popularized the foie gras, and that's how it spread. It actually originally spread because the Jews were raising these birds. So crazy,
So interesting. Oh
interesting
my
fun
word.
fact.
I love it. I love it. History is just so fascinating. And it's just so many details at play, right? Both the politics and the religion and the food and, and then the technology that they just needed a fat. And so
Yes.
that's how it came about. And we can thank them for that process. Oh my word. So fun. The Chef's Secret, readers, all of those details and more, kind of through the pages of this wonderful story. So I want to just, kind of as our last question of the interview, talk about how you're bringing the Chef's Secret into the world. I saw on your website that you actually are doing a 3-course meal with wine pairings and the book as one of your release events, which I just love. Can you tell me a little bit more about like how that event came about, where the idea came from, and what people can expect if they decide to join you for that evening?
Yeah, I that to me is one of the best parts about working on food books, is that I get to go to chefs and to food historians and food bloggers and say, "Hey, would you want to collaborate on this? What, you cook this, you make the proceeds from the meal, and just I can, do my book alongside it." And they're always so generous and so delighted, and it creates just this amazing, memorable night. So for this book, I'm doing a dinner with Chef Josh Lewin, who is a co-owner at Juliet Restaurant in Somerville, which is one of the towns that right in the Boston area, and it's one of it's one of the best restaurants in the area. It's hard to get a reservation there, to be honest. And so I was so delighted when he agreed to do it. And I saw that there's a duck and olive soup, a beef sugo pasta dish on the menu. And I can't remember what the dessert is, but it's a 3-course meal, and you get a copy of the book, and then you can choose a wine pairing if you would like. And so it's so fun to actually, and at that dinner, I will talk more about the food history and in between the courses. And so it's at Juliet Restaurant in Somerville. And then along those lines, I actually put together a digital cookbook that many different food bloggers, historians, and chefs helped me create recipes for. And so sometime after the launch, I'll be making that available on my website.
Oh my word. So great. Well, I, for one, cannot wait to check out the historical cookbook and cannot wait to read more about it in the Chef's Secret. So must readers, please do check it out. I'm going to flash this gorgeous book one more time. The Chef's Secret by Crystal King. And thank you. Thank you so much for telling us about your research and your stories and your books. And please keep up the fascinating work, and congratulations.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad to have been here and hung out with everybody. Thanks.